So here is presentation for the day. We're talking about total ethics fashion, which is the premise that collective fashion justice as an organization exists to try to turn into a reality. And we're looking at how total ethics fashion helps to redefine what we think of as sustainability in fashion and responsible production of fashion through supply chains, not just at tier 1 where garments are sewn by people, but all the way through the supply chain to tier 4 where raw materials are farmed or extracted. So to start off with, as I said, collective fashion justice exists to create a total ethics fashion system. And for us, that means one that prioritizes people, our fellow animals, and the planet before profit and production. It seems like it should be a fairly simple thing to get the fashion industry on board with, but as we know, that's really far from where the current fashion industry is in terms of how they produce fashion. The way that we as an organization primarily work to improve the fashion industry is by addressing animal-derived material supply chains, and this is because that's where all three of those groups are impacted at once. For example, if you look at a leather supply chain, we know that at the farm level, often there's Indigenous land rights issues, there can sometimes be forced labor, there's animal exploitation, there can be deforestation, there's a huge amount of methane emissions that impact the climate, water use. Across the supply chain, there's also tannery worker issues, pollution associated with that, slaughterhouse workers and their rights. And of course, in slaughterhouses, animals are also slaughtered. So that's just one example of how addressing those supply chains is a really kind of effective use of time, because there are so many harms that we can work to move beyond when we talk about them. So we talk about a just transition beyond harm and destruction. And we also talk about, you can't want to get rid of something without showing what the alternative is and what a positive future looks like. So we look at innovation, and we also look at how degrowth, slowing down fashion, circularity, the payment of living wages, wildlife protection, all of these positive things fit into this total ethics fashion future. So I coined the term total ethics fashion in 2020, and I did so in response to the fact that terms like ethical fashion, slow fashion, conscious fashion, sustainable fashion, we can come up with so many terms like that we've heard of. They've become so overused and misused to the point that they have often become either meaningless or they have been turned into words that primarily exist almost as a form of greenwashing, and that brands that are not genuinely interested in responsible fashion production use just to help them sell people more stuff, kind of, preying on the fact that people are interested to make better choices. So total ethics fashion aims to also create collectivity where there isn't at the moment. We often talk about sustainable fashion as addressing the environment, but that often means not considering the people who make our clothes or the animals who are exploited for those clothes. The same with ethical fashion. Often we hear that when we think about fair wages, fair labor practices, all of those kinds of things relating to humans, but we might still see that ethical label put onto a product that involves cruelty towards animals. For example, a sweater that is knitted by someone that is paid a living wage and treated fairly, but who is making that sweater out of wool that is derived from a sheep who has been painfully mulesed and tail docked and who ultimately will be slaughtered. And the same again is true for vegan fashion. We could have a bag that is free from animals, and that's great, but it could be made from PVC, which is harmful for the environment, and it could also be made by someone in a sweatshop who is not being treated with any level of respect. So total ethics fashion exists then to bring all of these things together. And this Venn diagram, I think, is the most effective way to start looking at that, because we can see how these three issues need to intersect. So this kind of shows what I was talking about earlier. If we have fashion which values other animals but not people, and I like to say other animals because we often forget humans are, one of many, many animal species on the planet, and our separation from nature is often a really big part of how we've got into this problem of destructive fashion production. But yeah, this Venn diagram basically exists to show how we can not get things right or nearly get something right, but be missing a certain piece of the puzzle unless we get to that center there and get to total ethics fashion, where people, animals, and the planet are all valued and respected. So to put it more simply, it really is just those three. If we get rid of all of the examples and explanations, it's about having value for all three of those things. But I think that it's important that we simplify this Venn diagram even more, and first we put it into two circles. So the first is moving it into two circles, which is fashion which values the planet and fashion which values all animals. And this is because, as I said, humans are animals as well. And so when we separate ourselves out, it kind of doesn't make sense, and it helps us to justify exploitation of other animals and other life on Earth. Human beings, Homo sapiens, we make up 0.01% of all life on Earth and just 2.5% of all animal biomass. So if we're referring to ethical fashion, but only referring to 2.5% of animal life, of sentient beings, that's a mistake. It's far too narrow for us to be making as positive a change as we could otherwise be making. So that next part is about putting the two circles together. And this is really important because while we view humans and other animals as quite separate, we have really clear scientific evidence that in the ways that matter, we are not different and we are not unique from other species. So the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness from 2012, that brought together all kinds of scientists from all kinds of different areas. And they came to this kind of one conclusion after looking at all of the data that exists on the topic. And that was that the absence of a neocortex, which is something that is in our brain, does not appear to preclude an organism from experiencing affective states like emotions. Convergent evidence indicates that non-human animals have the neuroanatomical, neurochemical, and neurophysiological substrates of conscious states, along with the capacity to exhibit intentional behaviors. Consequently, the weight of evidence indicates that humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. So basically, if we recognize that humans are worthy of having their autonomy, of being able to consent to things, of being able to, have their life and their body as their own rather than anyone else's, we generally decide that that is important because we recognize that we're sentient, that we have our own unique perspective, we have our own emotions and thoughts. If that is the basis on which we decide that individuals are worthy of safety and respect, protection and liberation, then the science shows that we should view that to be true for all of the animal kingdom. So this means that total ethics fashion does not harm, commodify, deny consent, exploit or slaughter other animals. But the circle can still be made smaller again into one circle. And this is because when we're separating valuing the planet in fashion and valuing life on this planet, that doesn't really make sense. The more that we separate humanity and animals and the animal kingdom from nature, the more we're able to harm both of those groups. This is something that is not a new concept at all. It's something that Indigenous communities have known and have tried to tell everyone else for a very long time, but it's something that the fashion industry doesn't seem to kind of cling on to and get. So, if we're talking about protecting nature, and fashion often does this through what's called carbon tunnel vision, where we hear the fashion industry talk a lot about getting to net zero and reducing emissions, but not necessarily about biodiversity and ecosystem health and wildlife and other animal protection. This is where we are able to kind of continue with a system that is causing harm to all of us. So by bringing that together again and recognizing that, this is when we get to the real crux of total ethics fashion, which is simply fashion which values nature and which values life, because that is what nature is and is made up of. So as it says here, what is the point of protecting the planet if it's not to protect the life on it and the individuals who live here and the intricacy of how we are all connected through it? I think that's a really important thing for us to keep in mind. And there are a few ways that fashion can value and protect, or at least minimize the harm that is done to nature. The first is by recognizing that unthinking ecosystems, so things that are not sentient but that are still a part of nature and that are living, like plants, soil, all those kinds of things, need to be protected. And we can do that by using materials that are as efficiently produced as possible, so which require less land, which require less inputs, less resource extraction, and by focusing on creating a system that doesn't pillage, pollute, and heat the planet. A really important part of this is embracing degrowth and circularity. At the moment, experts suggest that the fashion industry has to reduce its extraction and use of resources and its waste by fourfold if we're going to live within planetary boundaries. Planetary boundaries are about essentially how much we can take from nature before we're taking more than it can replenish naturally. So essentially how much we would need before we would need another planet. So that's the first part. For protecting human animals, we need to make sure that everyone across the supply chain, from garment workers to farm workers to people producing materials in between, so for example, who have taken cotton that has been farmed and who are weaving it into a material. All of those people need to be paid living wages, and they need to be protecting communities from harm. So it's not only about the people who are actually employed in fashion, but it's about the people who are surrounding fashion systems as well. For example, tannery workers, we know often tannery workers around the globe are more likely to experience cancer because of the many carcinogenic chemicals that are involved in common leather tanning. 90% of leather, for example, is tanned with chromium, which is a carcinogen. But that doesn't only harm tannery workers, it harms their communities, it harms the wildlife that is surrounding tanneries, because pollution often is released out into waterways and into the air, impacting everyone around it. That brings me to the next part, which is how fashion can protect free living non-human animals. And that is firstly by not viewing wildlife as commodities. So for example, we see that in Australia, where I am, native saltwater crocodiles have lived on this land for about 100 million years. Today, there are more crocodiles that are living in cages and concrete pens that are owned by the likes of Louis Vuitton and Hermes that are exploited and raised for luxury handbags than there are living in their natural habitat. So that is not a part of a total ethics fashion system, and it's also not a part of a total ethics fashion system to allow biodiversity destruction, which in turn impacts wildlife. For example, in the synthetic industry, in the cellulosic material industry that produces things like viscose, as well as the industry producing materials like leather and wool, all of these production systems are often tied to deforestation. And that is not only an environmental crisis, but it's a crisis for species extinction because of all of the individuals that have their home in those habitats that are destroyed. Finally, we get to protecting domesticated species. So species that we have raised especially and specifically to exploit them and to slaughter them and to extract profit from them. So again, total ethics fashion system doesn't accept viewing any individual as a commodity. So a just transition beyond this system is a really important part of total ethics fashion. So the next thing I want to talk about is the Total Ethics Fashion Manifesto. So this is something that we are launching fairly soon, and it's something that we're looking to have people, whether they are students, whether they're professors and lecturers at your universities, whether they are public figures, politicians, not-for-profit organizations, fashion designers, anyone, We're looking for people to sign on to it and to see how signing on to the manifesto can be relevant to what they do and their relationship with fashion. How can they use it to help create positive change towards this system effectively? So I'm going to read it for you first. In the midst of interwoven environmental and ethical crises impacting the planet and all those of all species who share it, it is time for the fashion industry to transition towards a total ethics fashion system. A total ethics fashion system prioritizes the life and well-being of people, our fellow animals, and the planet before profit and further production. In order for fashion to align with this premise, it must prioritize autonomy and consent, refusing the exploitation, commodification, and destruction of all individuals and of the life of all beings and the planet we share. Ultimately, this means a just transition to a fashion system which pays living wages to everyone across all supply chains, which is slow, circular, and respectful of planetary boundaries, and which shifts to more sustainable and just alternatives to both fossil fuel and animal-derived materials, like those made from the skins, feathers, and fibers of currently exploited individuals. A just transition towards a total ethics fashion system is complex and it takes time. It requires innovation, retraining, economic support, cultural sensitivity, and a kind of progress which respects the value of tradition. It is required for sustained life on Earth. The Total Ethics Fashion Manifesto is not a demand that the fashion industry unfeasibly change overnight, but a recognition that a system which places all life before profit is the system we must continuously and boldly work towards through incremental yet radical and meaningful transformation. So that is basically the crux of the whole total ethics system that we want. These are the values that, while total ethics can become broader, there is lots of specifics that are involved in making that happen. These are the things that absolutely need to happen if we're ever going to work towards making this system a reality. So now I think would be a good time to talk about the manifesto, talk about your thoughts on it, how we can potentially get it involved in what you're doing for fashion, and to have a general Q&A for any questions that anyone has. So I'm going to stop sharing now so we can all look at each other and talk.
I was just going to say, like, this is not really a question, but it was like more of like the thought process. I found it really interesting the way you kind of showed how like using the terms ethical and sustainable fashion are like, they don't include everything that you were talking about. And that's like very true, because nowadays we're just able to toss the word sustainable fashion and think that like that piece of clothing is just like the end all be all, like everything that's good, like it's like making progress, when in reality there's so many little things that weren't considered when making it. So like that was just like something that was going through my head, which I thought that was good. But yeah, I didn't realize like how much was not included in the terms that we use every day.
Yeah, and I think that language is really important to talk about, because our framing of the world helps to create the world. So if we consider sustainable fashion to be, the goal, the way that that word is reflected and what it means and how it evolves is really important to creating change. So I think that's why the term total ethics fashion needed to exist.
Yeah, that was like a really eye-opening kind of presentation, that slide. Like I thought that was really cool. But yeah,
I'm glad.
do you guys have any questions? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, going off of that, I think the point you made about how humans are animals too, and how protecting the ecosystem as a whole in terms of the fashion industry, how it affects everything, like the plants, the water, the wildlife. It's not just one area or another. Like you brought up chromium for leather, and how working with that not only harms the worker, but it also harms the fields nearby, and it gets into the water and it ends up impacting the community as a whole. That's a big point, like that you brought to perspective.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really important thing to consider, because it is easy to isolate the fashion supply chain and go, oh, we only need to think about the people that are directly impacted. But if we do that, we're actually only addressing a very significant, but a fairly small part of the overall impact of fashion. So I think that that's where also ideas of community care come in, and it's also where ideas of community action are important. I think if we feel as though the only way we can change fashion is if we're a part of the fashion industry, if we're a designer, or if we're buying clothes, we're limiting how much change we can create. It's not true that the only way we can change the fashion industry is through, voting with our dollar. We can use our voices. And while it can feel kind of frightening as an individual to go, oh, I'm going to try to change this enormous global fashion industry, but I'm just one person. We're not just one person, because as a collective, if we consider all of the people who are in communities that are negatively impacted by the fashion supply chain and all of the people around the world who care about that, that's actually an enormous number of people. So if we can mobilize together, we have a really powerful collective that can create change.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Thank you.
I was gonna say, kind of like going off like the audience that we're catering to, which is like students, like how do you think using your like total ethics fashion help students like incorporate that into their lives, or even like a university club or something?
I think that everyone who is studying can consider how total ethics fashion relates specifically to what they're studying and what they're interested in. For example, if someone was studying fashion design, then obviously they would try to adhere to the total ethics fashion values when they're designing. But you could also be studying marketing, and you could then be looking into greenwashing and ethics washing, which is the same as greenwashing, but for kind of claims that something is fairly produced or cruelty-free. And you could look at how the marketing industry needs to change. You could also be studying law, and you could look at legislation to ban certain materials, or legislation to enforce protections against greenwashing, or to demand labeling that helps people understand the impacts of what they're buying. So there are lots of different ways that I think people can be involved and to make their interests useful and beneficial to a total ethics fashion movement. I also think for a club, the thing that we're trying to do is to get university clubs to join our like kind of global societies of clubs that are working in alignment with this manifesto. So to sign on to it, and then we're going to have resources available for them, which, you have been working on with me as well. So we'd love to see people having like book clubs. We have a book on total ethics fashion coming out this year, working on mending and all of these things that you have talked about, but to also kind of keep in mind that as an organization, collective fashion justice is limited insofar as we can only do as much as we can as individuals. But if we have clubs of people around the world in universities who are interested to create change, then we can do a lot more. Because we could, for example, say there's a university actually in Boston at the moment, and they are interested in doing a few things. And it started with one student who is interested in doing a research kind of initiative with us, and we're doing that. But now his class is also working together to see if they can mobilize and actually work for legislation in their local community. And that's really important, because local government, the whole point of local government is that people are elected in to represent the community. So if young people come together to engage with it, we can create change. And universities are a great way to kind of get people together as a starting point to that kind of local change.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I feel like that's what like school clubs do. Like they take super like not niche, but like local communities and start to like make changes where big like organizations can't, because sometimes when you're local, you can impact the people around you easier than like something that's like super big. But I like completely agree with what you're saying. Kind of going off that, like our club could also like, I guess, sign on to your manifesto. We could like talk about that and see like how we can help like other universities as an example, or set like an example for other universities using what you talked about during this presentation.
Yeah, I would love that. I think whatever you guys want to do in terms of getting involved, we would love to support. And that's the same for if there are actions, if there is something in your local area that you want to work on, we will always provide resources and support as much as we can to support that happening. So we can definitely talk more about that.